Really excited to be here, chatting with you all about patching. And I think it's one of those pieces in our security and IT workflows that a lot of people are puzzled by, or I guess, frustrated by is probably a better term, but it doesn't sound quite as good. And so from an agenda standpoint, what we've put together and just decided to walk through today is obviously starting with the pains, right? We'll cover some of the biggest reasons for the pains, a little bit of a sanity check, right? And just pains that we see from everybody that we speak to in the industry, but try to focus most of the session on actually conquering patching and endpoint management. How do we slay the beast, right? What are the solutions, not just the problems? And that's going to include, similar to putting pieces together, just like a puzzle, what are the actual approaches necessary? What are the key elements for your endpoint and automation process, just to make sure that you can start putting together a foolproof endpoint strategy and plan. Automation is a big piece of that we'll focus on today. And I think just in general, a key element for efficient patching, endpoint management. We'll talk about the sheer numbers, the stress, and I think it's impossible to get a handle on the patching dragon without automation today. So what does that planning look like? We'll dive into the people, process, and product of it, and really how to hit the ground running. And then Q&A, as Peggy mentioned. So any questions, any thoughts that you have towards the end of the session, we'll try to keep this as interactive as possible, right? And make the best use of your time. So that being said, let's take it away. As I said, I don't want to spend too much time on the actual problem, but I think it is important just to highlight the reality, the pressures on IT, and how that really has been increasing just exponentially. And often it's a space where the tools in-house weren't really developed, a lot of legacy tools, as far as today's space and modern IT demands go. So, companies have adopted the cloud, multiple operating systems. You think of the thousands of applications in your environment today just to keep, the workforce up and running, not only to keep it productive and efficient, but just keep it going in general. And the tools that the IT teams have really lagged behind that and caused, I think, first and foremost, a lot of complexity for these teams, right? So the on-prem solutions, I think, is probably the biggest pet peeve for a lot of folks off the bat. Legacy solutions like that aren't just costly to manage, where you're standing up, physical on-prem components and infrastructure at, your 300 different locations. It's also timely, right, and requires a lot of unnecessary complexity and oftentimes knowledge to maintain those rules. And then you talk about, the shift to on-prem, the shift to remote, now the shift to hybrid, and where it looks like the workforce for the majority is going to stay. That VPN dependency creates a pretty massive lack of control for a lot of companies today. And it's frustrating, right? Bullying people to get onto the VPN and making sure that you have visibility when you need it, making sure you have that control when you need it. And so on-prem hardware and VPNs were really built for the world of just the physical office, and it shows, right? Like I said, the lack of control is just not meeting those demands for teams today. And of course, with that, mantra of automation, minimal automation, right? Non-existent, a lot of manual work when you think about the workflows and processes that most teams have to go through to actually patch and manage their endpoints. Not only that, but manually keeping up to date with patching and endpoint management across that complex environment that we just talked about, the growing applications, a lot of inability to scale, right, when you have manual processes. And so automation is kind of like a buzzword, and we're seeing it everywhere in a lot of other industries. But like we talk about, a lot of what our IT teams are left to deal with is lack of automation and a lot of manual work. So talk about how important kind of that time to remediation is, how important reducing as much of the manual effort is for teams, not just for their own sanity, but from a security standpoint. Now, if you are numbers oriented like me, the below just helps quantify the pain that we talked about a little bit. And while I'm sure none of it is that surprising for you and for teams, I mean, it's definitely striking, right? So the first kind of statistic here and the pain stat of 74% just cannot patch fast enough, that really relates to the over half of IT admins that say they just don't have the adequate staff, resources, or tools to meet the patching workload. And that stat really goes back to the manual work we just mentioned and how, they can only keep up with so many hours in their day. And a lot of the times you're not just doing patching, right? You have a whole other host of requirements that you're trying to meet and day-to-days that you're trying to meet. And if you are one of those admins that is just doing patching, I can imagine there's a lot more you'd like to be doing with your day. This stat says 74%, but I can even tell you from my experience, and I'm sure for all of you on this call, I don't think I've had a single conversation with, people I've talked to, customers, prospects, organizations that say they enjoy the way they're doing patching, that say it's an efficient process or, something that they don't absolutely dread coming to work to do. And not to say that to sound bleak, but it is an expressed kind of heartache, right? And it's hard to hear that for folks that have said, I don't feel like I can go on vacation or turn my back or, enjoy just my weekends, knowing that we have a really inefficient and unscalable process today. So now the security concern as well of taking less than 10 hours for the time hackers need to find weaknesses in companies' perimeters, right, in unpatchable vulnerabilities to actually exploit. And so us as IT, just forcing us to be smarter, faster, stay ahead of these bad actors, right? But how? And that's what we'll focus on. So last year alone, kind of taking a look at 2022, over 22,000 vulnerabilities were discovered. And this number obviously encompasses all types of hardware, applications, software, IoT devices. But even if an organization is only dealing with vulnerabilities, right, from an average, let's say Patch Tuesday, the Patch Tuesday numbers are constantly climbing too, as we all know, right? 50 to 100 to over 100 new common vulnerabilities and exposures. And so they have to address that each month, and they have to address it in a timely manner. When you take a step back from that number too, and you think, okay, in general, when organizations have like a vulnerability scanning tool in place, right, or they have something that is telling them what's wrong in the environment, the majority of them have six figures plus, right, 100, 250, 300,000 vulnerabilities, if not more, that scanner is showing them, that they're having to deal with in the environment. And that final piece that often hurts more than it helps is just more tools, more unmanaged devices, and the complexity there. So we're seeing companies in general with larger number of endpoint management tools, larger number of endpoints, and having larger portions of just unmanaged devices, right? Kind of similar to that law of diminishing returns. Adding, like I said, more tools is not always better. And so there's gaps that can produce from that. There's a lot of complexity. There's, more experts and kind of tribal knowledge that you need in those cases, all adding to that pain. As I mentioned, we all know the pain. We all know what's wrong. We're all experiencing it. We're all kind of venting about this. And so this idea of how do we slay the patching dragon to improve that security posture, reduce all the manual work we're having to do day to day, alleviate that complexity and where things are falling through the gaps, and really just do more with less, right, is kind of the sentence that resonates with a lot of teams. So we can approach managing our endpoints from obviously a ton of different angles, but I think all primarily getting us to the same end goal, which is how do I get trusted, timely, comprehensive patching and endpoint management in place? And so from an approaches standpoint, I feel like it can feel overwhelming to tackle the management of all your endpoints. We just talked about the complexity. We talked about the pain. How do we keep things configured and secure? And so I like a very process-oriented approach. And, I think a lot of us in the space, it resonates well with. And we kind of call this the understanding your patching life cycle. And that's the diagram you see at the left-hand side. So at a very high level, you want to start with that inventory, right? Tracking the inventory of all your physical, virtual endpoints, your applications. It gets complicated, right, as your organization evolves and actually keeping track of that inventory. And when I was more on the security side of the house, I'd always say, you don't know what you don't know, right? And so knowing and gathering that inventory is especially true, right, as we continue into that remote work, as we mentioned. So maintaining an inventory of all the endpoints is definitely a critical step to ensure that each and every endpoint is actually accounted for so that we know how to then maintain those in the future. And that goes into the strategy piece of it next, right? Instead of diving in head first often, or taking things from a very step-by-step approach, take a step back. What are you trying to accomplish with your strategy? What are your goals? Are they time-bound goals from a security perspective? Are they aligned to larger business objectives in the environment? And then based off of a lot of those goals, just setting priorities. So you're not trying to boil the ocean at once. And we'll talk about all these approaches a little bit more. But what endpoints are most critical? What users are most critical? What requires the most attention just out of the gate? And then what other non-production and uncritical devices can you prioritize for later? And it's very difficult to do that, right? That's easier said than done. But taking an approach and starting to produce that strategy, right, and altering it is always better than not having a strategy up front at all. Of course, the automation piece, my favorite, just start automating early and fast and getting time back in your day. Of course, we'll expand on what that means. So I'm not just throwing the term, automate at you, but it is a key action that'll take, your IT team from drowning in those 22,000 plus vulnerabilities and that, six-figure risk score, that, million plus risk score, and being more strategic, being more responsive, and I like to say being more proactive with that side. And then verifying, right, that final step. So validate your outcomes and success after you've deployed your patches, tracking how they're performing, what time was saved, are we reducing our SLAs, were all the patches successful, and providing early stats kind of post-automation can help identify issues for quicker resolution in the future as well. So similarly, Automox has been thinking about this life cycle related to developing, kind of piecing together today's patching puzzle. And that offers an equivalent approach, but in this guide that we'll share with you all, we've captured many of the same tactics that I just mentioned that you can apply to your patch and endpoint management plan. So again, from inventorying to locking in a strategy to crafting automations, right, logging and reporting results, and just highly encourage everyone to leverage this guide. Again, whether you have not a huge strategy in place today or workflows and lifecycle in place, even if you have one and you're looking ideas for alterations, it just helps you get started in rolling out and maturing your patch and endpoint management planning. And I like the whole piecing together the patching puzzle analogy because it highlights, right, similar to a life cycle, but a little bit more plainly, if you are missing a piece, you don't have a full picture, and that causes a lot of problems in the environment today. So that brings us to just diving into some of the actual pieces to make this easier for you. And automation, right? Automation makes patching easier. And so from a benefit standpoint, I mentioned, I want to dive into what this can actually do. And so hopefully you can find and resonate with some of these things more than others. I know there's a little bit of hesitation around automation sometimes, especially in our space in IT, but hopefully breaking it down and kind of articulating it in this way is that will resonate and allow you guys to have some semblance of where do we move from here. So that first piece of the benefits is really just more control. Right? The inconsistent manual controls is what causes a lot of that systems drift. And when we talk about pain points, systems drift, device health is always one of the biggest ones that get brought up with customers. It is out-of-date endpoints. It leads to the pain-filled audits, right? Again, nobody's like, wow, I love my audits. I love the results that come from them. It's really a stress-free process for me. And so inconsistent workflows, often result in that messy manual handoff between IT and security. So automation is really just a piece of more control. How do we enable more control by automating away tasks that take IT into the weeds, right, rather than effortlessly scaling your IT into action? So I think that more control piece is going to be very important, especially with the inconsistencies, right? When we talked about the inconsistencies that cause security risks and issues in the environment, kind of brings us to that improved security posture as well, right? Over half of the respondents in our own kind of Automox 2023 state of IT operations reporting cited, hey, we improved security posture as their top reason for increasing automation, right? So though this is often a very much IT conversation because those teams are in the weeds, in control of patching, in control of remediation, it shouldn't be that segmented, right? There are clear and important improved security benefits and posture in place. And it's something that both teams are always talking about, right? I feel like every single report I see, every single like CISO and CIO report from the past 3 years was number one thing we want to do is go ahead and bridge the gap between security IT, improve security posture, whether you're on the security side or the IT side, a lot of crossover. And so that automated patching strategy just really enables you to block bad actors before they can cause damage, right? And dramatically reduce the time, the effort, the complexity just associated with securing your endpoints. Right? And automation also accelerates that patching your endpoints before the bad actors can exploit them. So that 10 hours figure we shared earlier, a little scary, right? How quickly they are working together. And so that time to remediation, those SLAs we'll talk about, are more and more important, right? Improve security posture. And then you get into, potentially the more business side of the house with reduced cost and how important that is for all the conversations, especially today, right? We need to be efficient. What is our budget being used for? How do we know that this is saving us time and money and a proper use of the limited budget that we have today? So another recent study we did shared like 60 plus, maybe 61% of orgs are turning to automation to deal with staffing issues. And so that's not just staffing issues in the sense that we can't hire, but our staff is so spread thin, right? The jobs, the hats, the roles that they're trying to fill are extremely difficult. And then finding and keeping happy IT staff is not only challenging for organizations, but like the cost of full-time employees can make hiring difficult too. And so how do we balance this? How do we make our staff happier today? How do we feel like we're providing them a way to spend time on what they need to spend time on and want to spend time on, and not creating a lot of those costly, complex manual work we talked to, right? And so automation can free up IT cycles from multiple days to allowing your staff to work on more strategic efforts, while also reducing the total cost of just controlling and managing and patching your endpoint management, right? When we talked about the issues in the space kind of on that earlier slide, the really legacy tools, the complex tools, you're also paying to maintain infrastructure, paying to maintain certain VPNs and visibility, and all that adds into a very high cost with a lot of people not being happy. And then just in general, less room for human error, right? And I don't say this in a way to kind of put the weight all on our sysadmins and our T teams, our security teams, but we just talked about the sheer impossible numbers for humans to manage manually, right? And manual patching being just the frustrating and mundane work it is, it's prone to human error. It's prone to, missing one out of those thousands of vulnerabilities. It's prone to things falling into the gaps because of the complexity and lack of automation that we mentioned, and prone to increasing the likelihood of missing patches and unmet SLAs, which loops back around into, that improved security posture and a lot of those concerns that team have. So, with delivering what we can from repeated tasks consistently, automation will improve those IT mistakes that happen by sidestepping any room for human error in general. So, talked about the benefits. Where do we start, right? How do you initiate your automation journey? How do I actually move forward with this kind of buzzwordy seeming type a topic, and what does that include? And we like to talk often about just the people, process, product, right? The 3 Ps, keeping it simple, 3 Ps that a lot of organizations use building out their own internal tools and technology, and relating it to automation and patching and endpoint management is super helpful there as well. So laying the groundwork, let's get a bit into the 3 categories more. And, as Peggy mentioned, all the slides will be sent to you later. So hopefully you can start organizing your thoughts around people, process, product, and automation. And hopefully this is beneficial. So, first and foremost, just from the people, right, and getting team buy-in, who will your automation impact, right? Checking in with those key members and getting their buy-in and feedback. So for example, if you're speaking with purchasing manager, cost savings in that, the previous slide can typically help win them over, creating reports and generating what those cost savings will look like compared to what you're doing today is money talks, and one of the best conversations to have with those purchasing teams. We've created calculators for that. A lot of organizations are moving that way because, again, we're all numbers oriented today, and it speaks in a quantifiable way a lot better than other pieces can. And so, like I said, leveraging industry calculators to demonstrate that is super important. So we've linked the calculator on the slide here. Team buy-in from other people, such as defining process owners. And this is a trickier space considering we talked about that gap between security and IT, but you have buy-in and process owners on both sides of the house typically, right, for remediation. So know who can help you with the processes, know who's going to be your advocates. And so when you manually patch vulnerabilities, does a handoff take place with security? Their team should be on board to help, as we mentioned. They're finding all these issues in the environment. Now your team is remediating it, right? It's making them look good because those vulnerabilities aren't just going up and up and up to the right, but we're reducing that. We're sending a foundation of compliance with what we know we want patched in that automation, what we know we want configured in that automation. And that kind of gets into just securing executive sponsorship in general. So some automations just never get off the ground due to lack of management support. Sometimes it's a mindset shift that needs to happen with the executive teams who have been doing things a certain way, and understanding that mindset shift and getting management on board, or finding an executive sponsor to help sell that more modern automated vision to help meet those goals that we talked about earlier. In-house knowledge is always important leading off of that. So when I talked about some of the legacy workflows and things that people are used to, you find the in-house knowledge automation experts that you might not know of in the org. I would say from an IT standpoint, a lot of that probably comes from security, right? Security is a lot more zero trust and automated forward than we are today, and leveraging their experiences and how they got buy-in to automation, a few years ago when that shift happened on the security side, will just help, make your cause all that easier, right, and leverage their experiences. And brag for future support. So has automation saved you time and spent patching by a specific percentage? Do you now remediate critical vulnerabilities in less than 24 hours when you used to do that in 30 days with a lot of manual work? So sharing those automation wins, whether you're just testing a product or you're starting to implement little bits of automation here and there, will also increase that support with kind of your people ecosystem. Process, this one is typically my favorite, and I think it kind of bridges people and product, and that's why I like it so much. And when we lay out people, process, product, those are organizational sectors to help you think of, how do I start building out those strategies and organizing what is important, but they're not silos, right? They do bleed into one another, and it's important to remember that we want to eliminate those silos where possible. So just 101 from a process standpoint, identify those frequent mundane tasks. It sounds obvious. It's like we know everything is manual and everything is taking longer than it should. But it's actually going through that exercise and maybe highlighting the top 5 most exasperated, repetitive weekly tasks. It's jotting down those and actually seeing how long that list of mundane tasks is to help quantify, right, and strategize. So consider these kind of low-hanging fruit and automate them first, most mundane tasks. Then understanding your current workflows and processes. Again, a lot of this sounds kind of very, hey, of course we're doing that. But in another survey and recent surveys, 62% of IT pros cited that inconsistent processes are a challenge. So just understanding those current workflows and sometimes the difference between what do we think is a current workflow and process versus what's actually happening, right? So validating that process is working as a manual task before automating it incorrectly and vice versa. Then determine priority and severity, right? Another piece today as you form your patching strategy. Keep in mind while patching, every single endpoint sounds ideal, and that is the dream, and patching all the OS and all the third-party applications. It just might not be realistic out of the gate. And again, to set yourself up for success and to not boil the ocean, just prioritizing, as simply as it sounds, right, is helpful. And a good rule of thumb is to prioritize by just your organization's greatest risks, greatest security risks, as that's where the media talks, that's where your company talks, that's what gets people buzzing. What's the security risk? And the highest potential impact to your business itself, which we'll talk more in the product piece. And we talked about in buy-in, right? Those business impacts are critical to understand and get buy-in for automation purchases, and just developing those process-oriented steps. So using the word process in the process category, but procedures where you already have in place as inspiration for really your automated steps. But definitely be sure to reflect and kind of walk through each step, ensure it's still valid, and most importantly, if it can still be easily automated. Now that brings us to the product side of the house, which we said can be tricky with product fatigue, with alert fatigue. So it starts with just knowing your tech stack, right? Understanding what solutions you have that can support automation, as is, and where you'll need help. What are the tools that are really dragging down automation and that are requiring us to do things very manually? You don't have to squirrel on the shiny objects and the shiny technologies. Like we said, as more tools doesn't always help, it can really hurt and create more problems, more complexity, more gaps, and more issues. And that's knowing your tech stack across the board too, right? So not just our IT tools, but what are the security tools that we're using, the procurement tools, because often if we can find tools and spaces that can keep plugging into each other like a puzzle piece, or continue to bridge the gap between different people, different processes, different teams, it's extremely valuable. And that's where a lot of tools are heading. So getting rid of, the tools that are kind of stuck in very incumbent, very legacy, they don't play nice with others. They're just acquiring a bunch of companies and adding on, even within their own tool, there's really no cohesivity. And so that's where knowing your tech stack and kind of addressing and jotting down some of those pieces come into play. Definitely biased, but leveraging SaaS, right? Starting with leading edge, cutting edge SaaS technologies as automation capabilities inherent their platform. So SaaS is where the future is heading, such as, automation. There's a lot of tools out there that are built to help you take back time, to cut complexity, to cut cost. And we've seen a lot of organizations move towards cloud-based SaaS platforms, but just saying it again to kind of help you get that buy-in from your people, help move it into your processes. These are the products that we want to be using, right? These are the products where security already headed years ago. And now from our endpoint management and patching and configuration, this is where we need to head to, right? To kind of stay up to par and to lead automation and processes that work. So, you don't have to reinvent the wheel as well. When we talk about endpoint hardening, and I kind of just alluded to it very quickly, but leveraging existing work that was created, leveraging existing scripts. So whether you already have in-house PowerShell or Bash experts, or just reusable units of work, don't reinvent that work and instead search for existing scripts to automate your workflow and tweak as needed. And I mention this because the bad actors work together, right? The bad actors work together. They don't reinvent the wheel. They're communicating. And so for us, doing the same, right? Log4j came out and, first and foremost, it was how do we create a script that remediates this, because you can't patch. And most people still can't patch today. So rather than, the teams on their own having to go out and spend days or weeks of their time prioritizing remediating the 0 day, we want to leverage what exists in a positive way. And then just products that demonstrate results and you yourselves demonstrating results. So a lot of this comes down to just reporting and like centralized reporting capabilities, right? Gathering, organizing, prioritizing your endpoint management successes. It can get messy, right? Even with automation in place. So you want to make sure you have the right tools that actually showcase your results. They showcase them consistently, they showcase them easily and quickly. Right? That's super important for a product that's actually remediating things and getting things done for you in the environment that's fixing things for you. We've also created an automated patching checklist as well. So we'll kind of share that as guidance. You'll see it on your slides there. And just in general, overlaying what we've talked about for automation, a few things that are important not to forget. Identifying SLAs, right, out of the gate. And so, what metrics will you track success against? So a lot of people have in-house metrics. It's just almost like a pipe dream or goals, right? I want to patch from 30, 60, 90 to, 30 days for anything general. I need my third-party applications patched in 15 days, and I need anything critical patched within 24 hours, right? And so setting those in-house goals and SLAs and then being able to track against them and a tool that can automate against them is super important, right? A lot of standards like CIS, Cyber Essentials Plus for our, folks overseas, those are really important. And are your metrics defensible? So part of that is just because in this space, if something were to happen, we're often scapegoats, right, on the administrative side of things. And so making sure metrics are defensible, not just for your own team and conversations, but to say, hey, these are the SLAs, this is the automation I wanted in place to meet in case you do come up against any sort of, I would say, friction there. And part of that is document, right? Document. If it's not documented, it doesn't exist. And too often a lack of testing or documentation ruins a really great strategy, right? By creating undue lag or friction, like I said, with team members, or really just blocking the opportunity to retrace steps and fix an error. We'll talk about this a little more, but I think a lot of times that's the hesitation against moving towards automation, right? Is we just don't know what's going to happen, but that's not true. Implement tools that document yourself, implement processes that you're documenting. And then take that, fine tune and expand, right? So as you grow more automation savvy, as you start to put in these people, processes, and product, you can expand that whole, hey, I don't want to boil the ocean, I want to start with the specifics. You can expand that automated reach to other tasks, right? Further free up your team's time, further free up resources, get to projects that you didn't think you'd ever get to in the past. And so, from a patching perspective, like I said, I want to thank you for joining me. I hope that this was helpful to kind of help silo some of the things for you in your head of how do we even start to think about the problem? How do we start to think about the fixes and the life cycles and piecing things together? And then, of course, the automation and how that lays groundwork for all the benefits we talked about, right? The cost savings, the people, the time savings, the security reduction, or security risk reduction, I should say, right? Improvement of security. And then, in general, how do we actually go about that with the people, process, and product, and give you some concrete steps that can hopefully get you thinking, right? Get the wheels turning on how we can improve this with doing more with less, as I kind of said before. So I want to say thank you just for listening to kind of that general overview of how we approach the puzzle that is patching.